Vladimir Ulyan worked as a security guard in one of the old, abandoned factories on the outskirts of Moscow. He liked this job, although many considered it dull and hopeless. The factory had long ceased to function, but the owners kept it under guard, fearing that the old building could be seized by homeless people or drug addicts. Vladimir saw this place as his cozy corner. There was little work, a walk around the territory every few hours, and sometimes fixing something if a pipe suddenly burst or some kind of commotion began. The factory building, like everything around it, seemed to have been forgotten by time. High brick walls, windows long since knocked out by hooligans, and massive gates that once served as an entry point for trucks with raw materials now hung like silent guards over the deserted area. A narrow river flowed around the factory, its muddy waters only emphasizing its abandonment. However, over the years, the job of a guard here began to affect Vladimir in a peculiar way. He began to notice strange things. Sometimes noise in the corridors where no human foot had stepped for a long time. Sometimes shadows flickering outside the window on dark nights. At first, he attributed it to the wind, to fatigue, or to the old age of the building itself. But the more time he spent here, the more often these strange sensations became. One quiet night, when everything around was plunged into darkness, Vladimir heard a knock. It came from the depths of the factory, from one of the warehouses that had not been used for a long time. Vladimir shuddered, rising from his chair in his booth. Usually such sounds were explained quite prosaically: rats, wind, whatever. But this knock was persistent, measured, as if someone or something was trying to get out. He took the flashlight and keys and, slightly nervous, went on his rounds. The light of his flashlight barely penetrated the darkness of the old corridors. The echo of his footsteps carried through the empty building, and even the quiet rustle of his movements seemed loud here. When he reached the warehouse door, the knocking died down. Vladimir stood there in indecision. He did not want to open the door, but as a guard he had to check. Turning the key in the lock, he did not immediately notice that everything was just as quiet behind the door. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was dark and damp. The damp walls stretched upward, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. Vladimir illuminated the space with the flashlight, examining every corner, but found nothing suspicious. Perhaps he simply imagined it? But then the light of the flashlight slid along the wall, and Vladimir froze. Fresh footprints were visible on the brick surface. They were strange, as if someone had run their fingers along the wall, leaving wet traces. And the more he looked at them, the more it seemed to him that these traces were drawing some kind of pattern, imperceptible at first glance. "What is this?" he muttered, bringing the flashlight closer to the wall. The traces were long, as if someone had run their hand along the wall, as if trying to break through the brick. They continued further down the corridor. Vladimir, driven by curiosity and anxiety, followed their trail, lighting his way. Soon he noticed that the wall along which the traces went looked unusual. The bricks here were not as old and cracked as in other parts of the building. Moreover, some of them seemed almost new, although their laying was clearly sloppy, as if they had been installed hastily. Vladimir's anxiety grew. The tracks led him further and further to an abandoned part of the factory that had long been boarded up, and the closer he got to those locked doors, the stronger his desire to stop and turn back became. But some unknown feeling, pushed him forward. When he approached the last door leading to the far hangar, his hands were shaking. This door had long been sealed, boarded up with massive boards, and no one had set foot there for many years. However, that same knocking came from behind the doors again. This time it was more distinct, and it seemed as if something was trying with all its might to get out. Vladimir took a deep breath and knocked on the doors. The noise stopped. Silence hung over him, pressing on his ears. Unable to bear the tension, he turned around and hurried back to his booth. He did not want to deal with this anymore. But something had changed since that day. The knocking continued to haunt him. Every time he tried to fall asleep at his post, the sound would come from somewhere behind him. He began to notice shadows flickering behind the windows, even in places where light should not fall. And at night it seemed to him that the walls of the factory were whispering something to him, barely discernible, but so frightening. Vladimir slept less and less. His days began to be filled with disturbing thoughts. He stopped trusting his own eyes and ears. One night, when he heard strange sounds again, his patience snapped. He decided that this time he would figure it out once and for all. Taking a crowbar with him, he went to the sealed door. His hands were shaking, but anger and fatigue overshadowed his fear. He made the decision to tear the boards and enter the forbidden part of the factory. When the boards crashed to the floor with a crash, a dark, damp room opened up before him. It was larger than he expected and empty. Except for one thing in the center of the room, there was a deep pit, surrounded by an old rusty fence. This pit seemed bottomless, and from its depths came a faint noise, reminiscent of the rustle of many voices. Vladimir came closer and peered into the darkness. Something was moving inside the pit. He could not see what exactly, but in his heart he had a feeling that this something was alive, and it was looking at him. He wanted to retreat, but then something like a whisper came from the pit. "Let us go," the voices whispered. Vladimir froze, trying to comprehend what he heard. But before he could do anything, thin, writhing shadows rose from the pit and surrounded him. They reached for him, wrapping around his legs and arms, as if trying to swallow him into the abyss. Vladimir screamed in horror and tried to break free, but his body felt like lead. These creatures, these shadows, were incredibly powerful. They dragged him toward the pit, their whispers growing louder, turning into a scream that thundered in his head. The walls of the factory began to distort, becoming alive, as if they themselves were part of this nightmare. As his feet began to slide over the edge of the pit, Vladimir cast one last look at the sky, trying to scream, but instead of words, only a hoarse whisper escaped his mouth. The shadows swallowed him, and his body disappeared into the abyss. The next day, he was not found. The factory remained abandoned, but locals said that at night, sounds came from its walls knocking and whispering, as if the building was trying to hide something. Those who dared to approach the factory were haunted by strange visions. But no one dared to cross its threshold anymore.